Hi, everyone. We're just getting settled as we begin, in order to begin our webinar. Glad you can all join us. We always give a couple minutes because the login process takes everybody a few seconds. It's great, as usual. We're joined by people from around the world. Once again, underscoring the global aspect of Global Institute of Church Management, but more importantly, the global and universal aspect of the church. So it's exciting. This is one of the reasons I love this project. It's just to expose us all to, again, these global concepts. So we're getting our people are getting logged in. I'm going to go ahead and start. Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Pia de Solenni. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Global Institute of Church Management. Today, in our ongoing series on transparency with the program of church management in Rome, we're going to be looking at the topic of financial transparency for dioceses. We're honored to be joined by His Grace Archbishop Anthony Muheria of Nyeri, Kenya, Jim Lundholm-Eades of the Leadership Roundtable and a frequent teacher for us, and Father Cristian Mendoza, who is from Mexico and also frequently teaches in a program of church management in Rome. I want to thank you all for sharing your time and your expertise. Before we get started, I want to remind all of the participants of our format. I'm going to have a conversation with the panelists for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then the rest of the time is reserved for question and answer from the other participants, our viewers. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you're going to see a Q&A option, and that's where you can submit a question at any point during the webinar. So use that at any point during the webinar. Just feel free, type in your question, and we will do our best to answer all of the questions. Sometimes we'll answer the questions later on our website if we don't get to them. Sometimes we'll combine questions, but we try to be as efficient as possible. So turning to today's conversation, we know that throughout the world, Catholic dioceses face tremendous challenges in achieving financial transparency. And I think, to give a little bit of context, transparency is not a challenge just for the church, it's also a challenge for other societal organizations and governments. I like to think that the church can model this for the rest of society, for other organizations. But the reality is that there's a combination of factors, including cultural, legal, and political, that directly impact how each diocese is able to practice financial transparency. So to get the conversation started, I'd like to turn first to Jim. Jim, could you give us a definition of transparency to start with and maybe an application of it?
When we think of transparency in the old days, so to speak, way back when, it was a case of, oh, if people want to see my finances, they're welcome to come to the office and they can see them whenever they like. That's the way it used to be. What we've moved towards now is transparency really means I've presented information, not just data, but data that's been turned into useful information. And I give people the opportunity to interact with me as the church leader about the information. And people have opportunity to interact with me as a church leader about the information that's properly presented. And there are certain expectations people have these days around that, around what constitutes the amount of data, the amount of information, I should say, given, and what format it should come in. Is that helpful to you, Pia?
That's great, Jim. Thank you. I appreciate that. Archbishop Muheria, maybe if I can bring you in, could you share with us a little bit of your experience? Because you've been in several dioceses, you've faced these challenges head on, and could you just share some of your experiences, some of the challenges, and what you did to bring about transparency in the diocese in which you've worked?
Thank you very much, Pia. Hello, everyone. I think, thanks, Jim, also for explaining a little bit about what are the expectations of transparency. But in general, transparency, not only financial transparency, doesn't only mean the revealing of the figures, which most times we reduce as to the persons who wins to inspect. But I think it is also a moral tenet whereby we expect the people to be at ease about the stewardship we have made of the resources that have been entrusted to us. So be they big, be they be small. And that stewardship is measured not only by the accuracy of reporting financially, but also by the interrogation that Jim has also referred to, that may go beyond just the numbers, that is the prudence of the use. In my experience in dioceses, I was in my former diocese of Kitui, where we didn't have a financial solidarity also, so it wasn't a solid financial sustainable diocese. It was where we are running the diocese largely by debt and trying to make the diocese grow into self-sustenancy. The process isn't just about saying how much we are in debt. It was a question of letting the people understand why we were making certain choices. And we had a great response when we explained, maybe not with financial figures, but by taking them through why we have asked these contributions, why these contributions have been directed here, and what have we been able to do, be it big or small, what are the results of the resources that we have received. And the experience has always been one, great satisfaction. And I think this is, we as church want to have our Christians, our faithful, satisfied that their little mite or their little penny has been used in a useful way, not only for the poor, spread of evangelization. So that great satisfaction of the church, of the members, is very important. And that has the reverse effect also, or you may say the positive effect of that people are more willing to be engaged, more willing to contribute, and more willing to come on board. And that's how we saw this diocese come from a difficulty of non-sustainable at the beginning to a level now where it's self-sustaining, again, because of the effort that the people, you pull them up in these circumstances. But there are certain other challenges that come because, well, we enjoy tax exemption for quite a number of things, and this also requires as a prerequisite to present audited account. We have been auditing our accounts for a long time, but it's expensive and very prohibitive for dioceses that don't have money. So you have to perhaps do it with persons who may not be the best in the market. And that's the problem, the first problem. But the second is that disclosure at times can also be dangerous in certain environments. So while being transparent, while explaining as much as should be reasonable, we also have faced the difficulties, especially in an environment of corruption, that you have, as it were, let's call them hawks, for not calling them vultures in the culture of corruption, who will take opportunity upon knowing about some of your assets or about some of the initiatives to try and influence or wrestle them from you or demand unreasonable and disproportionate amounts for what you have said. So I think transparency is a necessary tenet of stewardship, not only to the people we are serving, not only to authorities, but I believe first and foremost to God. But while moving towards a transparency that is more numerical, I think there should be a deepening of transparency that is the responsibility of any person in responsibility in the church must look, as it were, coram deo, seeing what the responsibility of a good steward, maybe looking at the parable of the talents as an example.
Thank you, Your Grace. If I can just follow up, how long did it take to bring about these changes in Kitui, and what were some of the cultural challenges that you faced with people within the diocese, or were there challenges?
Yes, there are. And thank you, Pierre. First and foremost, transparency is linked to governance, good governance. And good governance is about collegiality, it's about bringing people on board who know better than us, who are better endowed in certain expertise, who will help us on. And the cultural setting often has been maybe more clerical, because a lot of the priests and people in authority, including the bishop, have been perhaps more knowledgeable in many areas. But that is shifting, thanks be to God. And the idea of bringing a lot of the lay people to collaborate is still slow in picking. And when I went to the Diocese of Kitui, and even in my former diocese, my first diocese of appointment, the Diocese of Embu, my first desire was to set up good governance structures, bodies, having persons who are going with expertise and bring that knowledge, corporate experience on board that we can now harvest from their knowledge, so that we can start doing something that is acceptable and following their achievements or their knowledge. So that took a long time to educate on the governance or good governance, bringing people on board. There was resistance to bring laity in boards that had been predominantly clerical. By that I mean most of it priests. And therefore that faced a little bit of resistance, but no sooner did they see the effects and the fruits of this engagement of, say, accountants, professional engineers, of lawyers, of people who are in business, then they saw immediately that the ideas were, on one hand, much more mature. It widened our scope. It even widened our reach to places where we'll never reach. So that took, I would say, about four years in the Diocese of Embu, which was almost my full tenure there. And the first 4 years in the Diocese, putting boards in every places we could, and then taking them into workshops where we could try to explain to them what we were trying to do, and making a very robust who are stipulated by the canon law, but they are the ones who lead this path or this growth and progress, that they must know what are the weaknesses, not only from the audit, but from their own experience. And then they would guide, accompanying the bishop, advising him, and actually taking the lead as a board, of which the bishop is a member, but as a board, not as a bishop, not as a priest. And then trickling that down to the financial committees of each parish. There we had great challenges, because most of the financial experts, most of the persons who are professional are not in the rural areas. They've gone to the towns. So you couldn't get persons who would have desired to have there. And there is also the turnaround, the other side of the coin, that at times the priest who is there is perhaps not as experienced, not as exposed. And there is a little bit of fear of someone with too many degrees coming on your committee, they are too imposing perhaps. So there is, it's human. So you find the priest not wishing to bring someone who was perhaps too educated to advise him, because then you feel a bit of inferiority complex. And that's human. So to open is also an act of humility. And that act of humility is necessary for all church leaders. I, as a bishop, must be humble enough to accept the advice of perhaps someone else who tells me, sorry, Bishop, this decision may not have been the most just or most right or correct or prudent. And that act of humility is not always easy to, after a long tradition of authoritarian leadership. In Africa, a lot of that has been somehow transformed or transmitted from a culture of very strong authority, centralized authority, of, if you wish, chieftainship. It's not exactly chiefs, but you understand. So the culture of collegiality in some cultures in Africa was actually very strong, but most cultures, the strong authority was more what reflected good leadership. A leader who was strong, who was firm, but that's not necessarily the kind of leader we want now. We want a leader who consults, who hears, who is able to then bring other better informed and better prepared persons to make a decision. And so that's my experience. It took a bit of time, but I thank God now that in a diocese that was not well endowed, we were able to manage for 12 years. And now they're out of the woods in terms of they don't have to beg. We were 90% dependent on mission appeal, meaning going out and asking for assistance from our sisters and brother dioceses in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in other countries. But now we are basically self-sufficient, and for the little mission appeal we do is for project specific. So I think it is a tremendous achievement, but not because of, now here is where this collegiality comes, not because of one person, but because this team were able to guide and direct the growth of the financial growth because of good stewardship, and also because of good seeking fundraising, because you're able to present that there is a team that is very responsible and answerable.
Thank you, Your Grace. With that, I want to segue. I mean, it sounds like a tremendous success, and my mind is actually going quite quickly. I'm thinking of so many things that we could do with this content, but I want to turn to Father Cristian, because Father Cristian teaches in the program of church management. Father Cristian, right now, I think you're getting ready to teach, or you are teaching the course on fundraising for our intensive weeks as we start the fourth cohort in Rome. And Father Cristian, so Archbishop was mentioning some of the success that came from transparency and being able to shift to a model of self-sufficiency. And I was just wondering, could you speak again, specifically in the context of fundraising and donor relations, what impact is there with transparency? And I think it's a little bit counterintuitive for people, actually. So maybe if you could speak to that.
Thank you very much, Pia, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you, Archbishop Muheria, and with you, Jim. Something that Jim said actually is like the ground to start to speak about this culture of transparency, specifically for fundraising. And I think it's because Jim was saying that we need to find the useful information if we want to be transparent. And I think we live in a society that wants to give more and more information all the time, and wants to receive more and more information all the time. But if you think in the way in which we use them, like digital platforms and the social media, we don't always publish what reality is. We publish the beautiful moments of our lives, and this is natural to us. We show the nice photos of our family, we show the nice moments we had, we share with others nice things. So it's not necessarily that we show the bad or the problems or the needs we have. And these needs we have is what is essential. We are not used to transmit needs, but when we are transparent, we will be able to find the useful information to say, hey, we want to build something that is beautiful because this is the life of the church and this is what we're doing, but we have this need. But the need is not to be seen as a problem. It's always a great opportunity to grow and to do more things. So we live, it is true, in a sort of intoxication. We are intoxicated with information. So how can you find the right and useful information? And I think there's one concept that we could think about when it comes to transparency. Useful information is the one that is relevant. And I think when you have to face a donor, a potential donor, a friend, someone in diocese who can support the Archbishop appeal, well, you need to be very relevant because people are busy, because you have to go right to the point, because you want to transmit something that is inspirational. So I think this way of saying, okay, is really transparency linked to fundraising? It is in two ways. First, because you have to explain what you do, but most of all, because you have to explain why you don't do what you don't do. Because many potential donors would like to lead you to where their interests are. But you have to say, okay, but I'm doing this and not many other things. So I think this is something that I wanted to stress. And I don't want to take a lot of time, but many things come to my mind with the things that our Archbishop has shared. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Father Cristian. If I can just go back to Jim. Jim, when we were prepping for the webinar, you spoke of steps to transparency. Can you kind of walk us through those? Because again, this is really big, and you know, it's fine. Right now, we're just talking about financial transparency, but there are so many aspects of transparency. I'm sure the principles will translate across, but if you could kind of walk us through some of the steps that you had in mind, I would really appreciate that.
Thanks, Pia. Yeah, what in my experience with dioceses who need to move this way, financial transparency, where there's been an absence of financial transparency, there's quite often an absence of transparency in many aspects of how the diocese is run. It translates into a number of things, and it's a number of absences of transparency. It never happens. It never happens in isolation. When we do move toward transparency, there's really, in my experience, I've seen 6 things present during that journey. One is that you have the right people who have experience and knowledge of financial management. You need to have the right people, and those people are qualified, able to lead the financial aspect of governance because of their experience. Another one is then you need to train, as Archbishop said, training those who are in parishes, pastors in particular, but also people who advise the pastors. They have to know their role in church governance, and that clarity makes all the difference in the world. People in the parishes who do have expertise, if they're able to share that within the context of knowing their role, keeping things in right relationship as the church is designed, that's what makes it work. The third thing is to use, and this ties in with what Father Cristian said, people will grow their expectations around transparency if you have standardization around the way things are reported. And that standardization, if there's a financial management software program that's standardized throughout the diocese, or at least an agreement about what standardization in reporting looks like in your diocese. And there's regular publishing of reports. It's not happenstance. People get to expect it. And all this is that regularity and that standardization starts to build a culture of transparency. And in my experience, it takes about 3 to 4 years, no matter what the scale of the diocese is, when we've tried to shift people towards transparency. It's about 3 to 4 years because it's a culture change, not just a structural change or putting it in putting in information. It's embedding it in the culture, and that takes about 3 to 4 years at minimum. And then standardization also means standard means of recording transactions. So it means, for example, a common chart of accounts, as simple as that. The fourth thing is clear expectations, and that's really around standards of practice. Having that, however they do their financial management, there should be some expectation that how they're doing it meets certain standards, and you don't have to reinvent those standards. Those already exist. You can go to Caritas International. You can go to Leadership Roundtable has a set of standards for excellence for Catholic organisations. There's the Catholic Relief Services. All of them have guidance on those standards that you could use. The third thing is the fifth thing is some kind of external review or audit. Sometimes an audit is just, as Archbishop said, is just plain expensive. But having some kind of external review, some dioceses have been able to provide that to parishes using their own staff. Others, having that in place, where someone from the outside reviews things and says, yes, you're doing things the right way, and this makes sense to me. In an ideal world, yes, we would have an auditor, but as Archbishop said, that gets expensive. The last thing I'd say on this is not just a participation of the laity, but a leader who actively encourages laity and clergy to work together. An active encouragement, not just a passive agreement, but an active encouragement so that co-responsibility is a feature of their leadership. And the financial transparency and transparency in other matters as well is actually a natural outcome of that active encouragement. Putting the standards in place, putting in might be software, making structural changes, establishing committees, all of that will fail unless there's that active encouragement of co-responsibility for the mission and for stewardship of the resources of the diocese, of the church. In a sense, it's inviting people to take up their baptismal call of both the laity and the clergy to work together for the mission given to us by Jesus Christ, because it's always all about the mission. They're the 6 things I see happen in dioceses when they're moving towards transparency. And if you miss any one of those, it slows the process down considerably. And so there are many other things to pay attention to, but that's what I see consistently in over the last 20 years of watching dioceses make this movement. And, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I want to bring up a really practical question. So I think it was last year in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article on this topic, and the author suggested that the minutes of the Diocesan Finance Council should be public. And would love to get feedback from our panel. I mean, obviously in some places, because of the legal or the cultural constraints, that would be a liability. But assuming that's not a liability, assuming you're not kind of a church under siege with the hawks or the wolves circling, as Archbishop Muheria referred to, what do we think about this process? Because, and I'll add to that sometimes I see diocesan finance councils at a practical level, it seems like they're people who are just so honored to have been asked by the bishop to serve, that then they're also not, they're not ready to ask the hard questions. So when there's that line item that's kind of out of place and nobody says anything, nobody says boo. So there's 2 questions there. One, should we be publishing the minutes of the diocesan finance councils, assuming a safe environment, a safe climate? And 2, who should be on that council? I mean, how should they understand their role? And we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to go deeper, because the reality is a lot of people are just honored to be asked by the bishop, and they're not asking the tough questions. So maybe, Jim, if I can turn to you, and then I can have Archbishop weigh in, I'd love to get some feedback.
Sure. Yes, I've seen that happen. I was asked to go and look at a finance council in diocese, it's a large archdiocese a few years ago, and they were reviewing the financial reports they were going to publish at the end of the year. And on that report was an asset, on the asset side of the report, was $22 million not just named parish debt. And I asked what it was, and the chair of the board said, "Don't ask, just don't ask." I said, "Well, I've got it, it's $22 million, parish debt." Tell me. What had emerged was that when a parish was running out of money, they talked to the Vicar General. The Vicar General would then allocate funds from diocesan reserves as a loan, but the loans were never quite made it to being recorded, and it was all in the Vicar General's head. And this has been happening for decades. And the idea was that was a number nobody was allowed to talk about. Well, you do get that in some cases. That was a matter of changing the people on the board because they weren't able to ask. There was a culture, if you like, a practice of not asking the right questions. You do need people who are qualified and are able to speak the truth as they see it, to use their expertise on behalf of the church. But I have seen where the only answer is change the people on the board, unfortunately, because they've had such a long experience of not asking questions. In that particular case, those people had been on the board for 30 years, 20 years, and so on. That's too long. There needs to be a turnover of fresh faces. And that's one way of ensuring that the right questions get answered, is to have a turnover in the board on a regular and frequent basis, but not too frequent. Generally, about 3 to 5 years at the most is long enough. And then step aside and let's a fresh face in who's going to ask the right questions.
Your Grace, if I could ask you to chime in, particularly since you're in a different part of the world, you know, how, again, this question of should the minutes of a diocesan finance council be presented, and how do you encourage the members of that finance council to ask the tough questions?
Thank you, Pia. First and foremost, I want to agree very strongly with the pillars that Jim referred to, because they speak very well to the basis for transparency. And I think they're very, very, very punctual to the point. And one of the last he said is a good collaboration between the clergy and the laity, not a mere presence, not a mere bureaucratic exchange. And I think that will explain a little bit about the second point that you've asked. But as regards, I come to the question now, as regards the publishing of minutes, it depends on how well the finance council is working. If a finance committee of a diocese is working well, whereby there is good collaboration, good exchange discussions, there will be no fear of publishing the minutes that take place or what happens. But again, while as you are saying, we assume that we are in a safe environment, I believe that it's good always to put in a caveat there, that in the same way that great corporations do not publish all their board meetings minutes, they reserve certain issues, even for their competition, even to other. I think there should be a little bit of prudence in terms of what issues, even in what are your priorities. Not everyone who wants to know what we're doing in this transparency that you want people to know about your operations, not all of them are for good. And therefore, I think there should be a little bit of concern in that what we put out there should not act or be a reason for it bringing us downfall in the very ends we want to achieve. So I do believe, yes, there is no difficulty. I don't oppose, but I would, in the same way as a corporate, be careful about minute extracts as opposed to all the details. There is minutes and things which you can, the discussions and how they went. There are those which are for internal fora because they are not substantially affecting the result. And there are those which are what were the resolutions that were made. Those resolutions are for the public, there is no doubt. But the internal certain in-play discussions should, in my opinion, remain reserved to a certain reduced group. But coming back to those who don't call out and are not really given the necessary advisory support to the bishop or to the church institutions, here, while we would wish to have a rotation of membership in the councils, many times, like in our regions, we don't have so many to choose from. So you choose the best you can and you retain them as long as they are useful. But I do think that obviously you mentioned 30 years. Oh no, 30 years is way too long. I mean, 8 years is reasonable, even in our circumstances, because by 8 years, there will be many more people who've come in, or even 6 years. But it should be something that continues so that the good experiences are passed on to the next generations as we come of the membership. It largely depends, and here I'm touching a difficult one, I'm going into difficult terrain. It largely depends on the kind of leadership of the bishop or the priest in all those committees. When the bishop or a priest feels comfortable to express or even to show a bit of that vulnerability and is not fearful of the person or the persons who are going to bring the critique or criticize whatever is happening or give advice contrary to what he's thinking, then he's able to encourage the participation of the members. And I now come to this point which Jim was referring to, that the clergy and the bishop, I'm not only speaking horizontal, but if you wish, even vertical, they must feel comfortable in that space of interacting, discussing financial issues. There must be total honesty in the discussion. And so honesty is another pillar. Honesty in discussion, in giving opinion, is absolute in transparency. It makes no sense to have very high qualified people on your board, but they are not honest enough to tell you this or the other. They are not honest enough to give a true opinion of what the matter is, or even to give a reason for prioritizing one decision or one option or the other. So in my opinion, honesty is absolutely central for you to build up to this transparency we're speaking about. And in this context, therefore, my experience has been for all my committees and boards and persons involved in all those processes, we have many sessions, bonding sessions, social interactions, that they feel free in my house. They come, we're able to have a meal, we're able to talk about other things, and that breaks the ice of these barriers that may be there, and it helps them see the humanity or the openness, if you wish. So it's important too that we speak to those people who are in that position, and that is we, the bishops, so that we become a little bit more open, accessible, and inviting to critique. My first meetings always with my new members of my finance committee is to explain precisely, I have appointed them there, not so that they tell me what would please me, but if they cannot tell me what they think, then they are not worthy of being in that committee. And I think that is what we have to grow, the culture of frank, honest, of course, courteous, said in all the delicacy that one should do, but very clear and, if need be, candid, honest opinions given as regards, on one hand, financial transparency, but also as regards everything else that they feel that in evangelizing they're resisting, we're not giving it an importance, we're not giving it priority. They should be frank enough to bring it up. So I think we leaders do need encouragement so that takes place. Allow me just, Pia, just to add on to this, a rider, something that was said very quickly by Father Cristian. We took on about fundraising. We took on a project that was impossible in Kitui, to build a church, a shrine of Our Lady. Everyone said it's not possible. It was a poor diocese. We were not breaking even. We are depending on mission appeal. But we went out there and asked people to help us fundraising, not out of the country, but within. People gave in all kinds of amounts. We were able to raise in 3 or 4 years an amazing amount, over $1 million from a diocese that is very, very poor. Why? Because at every stage, we've made a tremendous effort to explain even to the last old lady in the village who had given nothing more than maybe 50 cents of a dollar, what we were doing to sell the idea and how we have used it. And we invited them to visit, and we walked to the place with them, and we told them, come and see, and we will take you there. And so the transparency was not only about giving them a financial statement, it was about telling them, this is what we are doing with your money. We've done this amount, and we have used this amount, and this is the amount you people give us, and this is a number of people who give me the contributions, and we are very grateful. So transparency is also the expression of gratitude back to the people And it is in fact a way of showing gratitude if you are transparent with what you've received. And as Father Cristian was saying, the effect is exponential. We thought we wouldn't even reach $50,000. $50,000 was a lot there. We did that by 10, 1,000 times. It's amazing.
Yeah, we lost connection, I think.
Yes, I think we did. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Your Grace. I want to follow up. So there's the document Pastoris Gregis, which was published in 2003 after the Synod on the Episcopacy, and in that document, they discussed the co-responsibility of lay and clergy to promote transparency. Particularly, sometimes there's an inherent conflict of the interest that arises when bishops are required to make decisions about clergy, whether it's related to child sexual abuse or other abusive behaviors such as, alcoholism, gambling, and so forth. And is it possible to avoid these conflicts if we implement this system of collegiality? And I want to tie into this, since I mentioned some of the problems, a question from one of our participants, and that is, should the payments for clerical abuse, should those be disclosed? Father Cristian, I'll let you weigh in.
So thank you very much, Pia. In this specific case, I think we should come back again to the essentials, like saying, what is relevant information here? I think these kind of events are so important to face and to stop, that you may be in a position to absolutely say what's happening. This because it is very important to stop these kind of problems. So it's very relevant. In the example that you were mentioning before, is it relevant to disclose all what is happening in a financial council? Maybe not. But we know that the solution of the urgent is never in the immediate. So we have to go back to the basics and say, okay, we cannot judge the persons and their opinions, but we have to judge the opinions on the persons who are saying that. So maybe what is useful, what is relevant, and therefore transparent, is to say or to publish the names of the people who constitute the financial council. Also because when you do that, maybe it's already something that is done by law in America, I don't know. But if you do that, what will happen is that when you show figures about the diocese, in this case also the figures regarding the abuses, well, the names of those who are listed publicly, they would have their own prestige there, and they want to be sure about what's happening in the diocese. So it's a way of double check that is not expensive. And when you invite someone to the financial council, you ask him, okay, but your name will be published, which means that everybody would know that you read this information. I think this is a way in which you tie transparency, that is relevance in the information, also with the idea of collegiality. How can I make the lay people and the bishops work together? Well, when I explain in the best possible way what is relevant, and when I tell the world that these important professionals are helping the church with their talent. I think these kind of ways are very interesting to do what you're trying to do, what we in this great program of church management are trying to do. This is what I would say.
Thank you, Father Cristian. Jim, if I can turn that specific question to you, how do you advise dioceses on the disclosure of payments for clerical abuse? Is that something that should be disclosed, the amounts? I mean, obviously we're not going to mention the victims, but should the amounts be disclosed?
Yeah, the welfare of the victims comes first, and certainly no announcement of payment directly tied to a particular victim should be announced. There's a whole lot of moral issues attached to that. But what should be disclosed is the sources of the payments being made, what portion of the payment is coming from insurance, if there's insurance involved, what portion is coming from diocesan reserves, what portion parishes are being held liable for, and what portion the diocesan operational funds are being held accountable for. So in that broad sense of here's the pie of what's being paid, and here are the segments, what are the segments at that broad level, yes, that should be disclosed publicly. What people should also know is that the bishop has talked this over with his finance council and has taken advice from people with expertise. That usually in these things, it's also good for the bishop to talk to the presbyteral council and his council of consultors, so that people get knowing that the bishop is not standing alone without that that he's not covering anything up, that it's gone to his advisors and he's taken good advice on what to do in this regard. And one difference I see is there was a time in dealing with sexual abuse where, I'm talking about in developed countries, Archbishop may have a different perspective on this, where once an accusation of abuse happened, the lawyers ran the process. What shifted in recent years is that the bishop needs to decide what's the right thing to do and then ask the advice of the lawyers in the light of that decision. That is, there's a morally correct way of responding to this, a pastoral way of responding to this, that those kind of decisions made first, and then ask the lawyers how they should respond. So the bishop, in his role as bishop, stays in charge of the process, and with his pastoral sense, with his governance sense of the diocese, and so there's always that context. The lawyers should advise the bishop in light of whatever is the right thing to do by the victims and by the diocese. There's a lot of things to weigh up there. So yes, be transparent, but choose what level of transparency, and people should know who the bishop has gone to for advice, and so people can see the pathway of transparency. There's no cover up. Yes, cover up is how we got to be where the church in America is today. We don't want to repeat that mistake. That's in the developed world. I don't know what Archbishop may have something to add from his perspective.
We haven't had much experience in handling serious cases in this area. However, I would be of the opinion that you have expressed, that it would be reasonable and it is expected that any resource that the church allocates to any one of its liabilities or expenses should be disclosed. That, I think, is a first principle. If it is about settlements of sexual abuse cases, that should appear in its report that this is the amount we have settled in these cases. And in that case, also, where has it come from? Because some of these are not exactly budgeted. So I agree entirely in terms of financial openness and transparency, that should be the way to follow. As I said, the legal processes are slightly different in the US than they are, for example, in our country. However, the point you've mentioned, the welfare of the victims, and then secondly, in my view too, is that while disclosing this, while listening to counsel, even in finances, canonically, and also the final word, advised and well-informed, rests, and the decision rests on the bishop. Having been advised, having taken the advice of all his councils, having looked at the pros and cons, so the direction is determined by the bishop who has been given that authority, but not on his own, but with the advice of all the teams that he has been granted to consult. So that is what I would comment on that point.
Thank you, Your Grace. I want to make one clarification from earlier in the conversation. When I asked the question about minutes, when I'm talking about minutes, and this is mostly for our viewers, I don't mean just a detailed conversation in the transcript of what happened in the Finance Council. I'm talking about minutes, and the rule that I follow in the US is from Robert's rules. It's parliamentarian rules, where you simply publish what are the decisions that were made, what are the votes that were taken. So it's not a play-by-play, and I just want to clarify that for anyone who's watching in terms of what we mean by minutes. Now, shifting back to the questions, I do, Your Grace, we're getting a lot of questions for you about auditing, and particularly where resources are scarce. Does the Vatican offer some guidelines as to what an audit should look like? Should people go to some of the resources that Jim has mentioned? What do people do in order to carry out an audit when resources are scarce?
We do not have any advice or guidelines from the Vatican or from local agreed forums. By this, I mean the Conference of Bishops, the Bishops' Conference, or the Association of Bishops' Conference of a region so far. It would be something worthwhile. But as it is now, what we have been doing and what I've been able to at least do is to work with certain audit companies that are reliable and that you are able to agree on a reasonable charge always, but with a reasonable charge with a huge volume, if you understand what I mean. So you are able to cover more areas, more dioceses, more institutions, and so they're able to get a good income, and you're able to spread, as it were, the cost across many more audits that they do. So we actually follow the standard audit of any organization. So the auditors we have used always are certified auditors. So our audit of our accounts can stand the examination of any scrutiny of any body that would like to look at it. So it is an audit that is done professionally. However, in some of the areas and institutions, like our parish, where we are not able to audit a parish because of the amount to cost, we try to have our own arrangement by getting a set of internal audit that we do. And that means that you need returns, and you need someone to look at it, and you need a less involving audit done, but you get a report, an assessment, and a health assessment of the finance and the finance of parishes. So we don't have yet a tool to follow or a protocol to follow, but I do believe that as we go ahead, we will be able to follow a lot of those. What we have had in the past, and maybe that is where this experience of going to external auditors, that when it comes to funding or partnerships that involve funding of projects, there is an explicit demand that those funds will be audited. And so that is why we are able to piggyback a little bit, that for a number of these programs that may be financed, they are financed also the audit portion of it. And so we are able to ask the same auditors to look at part of our own finances for a reasonable fee. So currently, for a poor diocese, it is expensive and sometimes arduous for them to actually have an audit. And oftentimes they will not have an annual audit if they're not able to pay for it. And they will do maybe every 5 years, which is what is required for us to submit to get the tax exemption. So you are more doing that in order to get gains. But the ideal would be that we have some kind of a team, external, and with a kind of a lead guidelines on what kind of audit they should do.
Thank you, Your Grace. And I think too, I mean, there might be a possibility to partner with the Metropolitan Diocese in order to use their auditors, as you said, kind of go present the auditors a bigger pool of clients, basically. We only have a couple of minutes, and I want to look to our last question, one of our last questions. And again, we've been given so many great questions, and we'll do our best to answer these and post them online. And Father Cristian, this is a little bit of a gotcha question, but I think it's a really good question. When should the bishop be the person who invites and selects the members of the diocesan finance council, or is it better that there's a committee that recruits people? Because in the secular world, for example, the CEO doesn't get to pick his board. So we've got some canon law questions here, and I don't want to step on canon law, but this is a challenging question. And is there a conflict of interest if the bishop is the only one picking the members of the finance council? Hot seat for you.
Well, I don't know. Archbishop Muheria may have much more experience, but I think you can put creativity here and saying, okay, a part of the members will be chosen by the bishop, a part will be chosen by the Presbyterial College, and then we will just choose prominent Catholics, people who believe. What is essential here is that the members believe and understand the mission of the church on the one hand, and on the other hand, that they are really professional. If they're good professionals and they are good faithful of the church, and you show the names, I think this would be more than enough to have success in a way. But again, of course, canon law would leave this responsibility on the hands of the bishop, who is the ordinary and has the whole responsibility to govern. This is what I would say.
And as we just wrapping up, Archbishop, I want to give you a chance, since you are a bishop, how you would answer this question.
I think first is not just the Archbishop who appoints, he consults. You look a pool from our priests, for example, from the people we are in contact, other lay people, would you suggest some people who can be in this council? And you receive a list of maybe about 20, 25. Then this list, you take it to first, you sound it out with your human resource people. Do they have the qualities? Do they have a good mix? And then you bring it to the consultors, and they are able to look into, and it's not just bringing them for endorsement. Can you check these names to find out whether they are worthy of including, both because of their moral conduct, but also because of their expertise? Once you have that, then from those names, the bishop picks the ones he's presented. So it isn't a one person, it's a process, just like the recruitment of many other places. So it's not a single person, it's a resource of a lot of other people who you consult with. And then only finally do you present that group, and it's done that again to the human resource to say, do we have the right mix? We don't only want to have finances, want some people who know some law, something about land, so it's a process of to and fro, but it's not a pick of the bishop alone. A pick of the bishop alone will not be fair, will not be right. And I don't think many bishops would do it that way if they really want collegiality. They will already get a huge pool of names, and from those use the governing organs to determine that small group, whatever number they may be.
Thank you very much, Your Grace. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, especially our participants. As always, we welcome your suggestions on how to make the program better. So feel free to contact us with your thoughts. I want to remind you too of our flagship program in Rome, the program of church management, where we are teaching these best practices to students from all around the world. And if you're interested in this program, I urge you to contact us. If this is something that you can support, we welcome your support. But the way that we change the situation in the church and really help to model the church best practices in the church to the rest of the world is through this education and through the implementation. So again, thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you all.
Thank you too. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.